What's up, people friendlies and non-friendly ghosts? How's everybody doing? Have you ever heard of this game before? Because I sure as hell have not, and it's pretty fun. I'm gonna just give a quick rundown of what this game is all about, and then I'm gonna show y'all to some, the highlights, gameplay. So this game is called Valkyrie Fight Tag. It is a fan-made game from the young 2000s. This is a tag team-based game. There are no assists. I'm not really a tag team fighting game player, so forgive me if it's the coup de grace is not all there, but I will say that I am enjoying it. Now the buttons are light, medium, heavy, and a tag button. You have air dashes and you have double jumps. You can air dash twice in the air, forward and back. Linking is pretty challenging in this game. It's not like traditional combos in your typical game. It requires like a just input. You have to time it like at the moment of impact. I'm not sure if there's cancel windows or if it's just some funky way that the linking works. You can jump cancel out of normals that connect on hit. You have a super meter. It's called charge time, as in Valkyrie Profile. People familiar with Valkyrie Profile on PS1, you'll be at home here. You start each match with 3 pips of charge time. Now for those of you who know, the more charge time you have, the worse, right? It's bad having charge time. So the higher it is, the less super you have. So you start each match with 3 pips. The more you use supers, the higher it goes. When it's empty, you have access to your ultra, right? So you need to empty the gauge to gain access to your most powerful attack. Heavy versions of your special moves are your supers. There's basic supers, and then there's the ultra. The ultras have a different command than the basic supers. To recover your charge time, you either juggle them or OTG them. Now in Valkyrie Profile on PS1, you OTG them, and that's how you would gain those purple orbs, and that replenishes your charge time, which gives you access to your supers. I'm not sure how true that is followed here, but it's definitely trying to do the same thing. And the other way of recovering your charge time is by tagging out. So your teammate is always going to be recovering slowly over time. Now, if you're familiar with tag team-based games, all the similar rules apply: recoverable health and yada yada yada. Your partners get rage after a set amount of damage that you take, and it lasts for like a couple of seconds. And one other thing that I failed to mention is that tagging in, there is a raw tag. When you're tagging, your partner runs ahead of you and gets into the action. They don't perform an action, they just run towards the enemy and then they stop. And it's up to you to take control from that point. The person who tags out stays on the screen, so they are vulnerable to being hit. So you often want to cover it, and you can do that by tagging out midst of an attack or a special attack, or even supers, the basic supers. So you could tag mid combo and try to set some things up that way. And that is the preferable way to tag out, is by having a multi-hitting move to cover your bases so they can't, get your tagging out partner. You can't tag out defensively, you can't do anything like that. Oh, and last but not least, there are parries in this game. You press forward, tap forward at the moment of impact. Your character will dodge, evade an attack. If there's a multi-hitting move, you have to press it multiple times. It's pretty sick. Camera zooms in and slows down a little bit. Character dodges. It's pretty tight. And that just about covers it. So yeah, I'm enjoying it. And we're going to be visiting this game again, because arcade mode is pretty difficult, challenging, and I want to overcome it. So we're going to be playing on the hardest difficulty. So this is not arcade mode, but it's survival, time attack, one of those two. And we'll get into more details in a later video. For now, I hope you can enjoy, and let me know if you ever heard of this game before, and I will bid you further ado. Peace, much love, stay cool. Deuces.